Warning, this episode contains brain food that will lead to improved emotional and social intelligence. Thanks for tuning in to Harvesting Happiness today for a healthy serving of consciously prepared brain food. This is Lisa Cypers Kamen, your host. For more than 13 years, I've been handcrafting these sound ideas for better well-being. Each week, I love spotlighting diverse thinkers and doers who are contemporary trendsetters and change agents, devoting their lives to creating a better world in which to live. I invite you to listen up and change the way you think about human happiness. Our award-winning content is fresh, optimistic, and purpose-driven media that promotes well-being from the inside out. Alrighty then, let's dive in. This episode offers psychosocial education designed to inspire and motivate our listeners. The information provided does not constitute a therapeutic relationship nor a substitute for professional mental health care. If you are experiencing a mental health crisis, call 911, go to your nearest emergency room, or for listeners in the United States, text 988 for the National Suicide and Crisis Lifeline. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you are. Thanks for joining me on today's show, where we are anxiously awaiting relief, a philosophical approach to the human condition. My guest today is Samir Chopra. He is a philosophical counselor and professor emeritus of philosophy at Brooklyn College and the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. Samir is the author and co-author of several books, including Shyam Benegal, Philosopher and Filmmaker, A Legal Theory for Autonomous Artificial Agents, and Eye on Cricket, Reflections on the Great Game. His essays have appeared in The Nation, the Los Angeles Review of Books, Eon, Psyche, and other publications. And I am super excited to have Samir Chopra in the house. Hi, Samir. Thanks for joining us today.
Alisa, thanks very much for having me on.
Well, I am anxiously awaiting this conversation because most of us, I'm not going to say most, all humans experience anxiety. And right, like if we are to believe that we should not experience anxiety means that we're not fully alive.
That's actually a really good way to put it. Or I would even say, if we weren't anxious, we would be gods, but we aren't gods. We're human.
Mere mortals.
We're mortals. We're mere mortals. And I would say, actually, if you look at what I would call the existential parameters and constraints of our life, the fact that we live in time with the past, present, and future, that this time is finite. And thirdly, that we are conscious that we have a past and a future, and that this time is finite, makes us anxious. And I think also our human capacities, we have limited knowledge and limited power. So while we are eager to know what our fates might be, eager to know what awaits for us in the future, we're also aware that we do not have control over the future, either in terms of our actions or in terms of what we can come to know about the future. If we were creatures who didn't care about the future, we wouldn't be anxious about these incapacities of ours. If we were creatures who didn't remember our past or anticipate the future, perhaps we wouldn't be anxious. But we aren't those kinds of creatures. We are creatures who remember the past. We sometimes regret the past. We are eager to move into the future because we have plans. We are worried about the failure or the success of those plans. So I think given this kind of being, which lives in time, this time is finite and it is conscious, this kind of creature is going to be anxious, right? So I say anxiety is inevitable in that sense for the kinds of creatures we are. If you wanted to be a little witty or a little pithy about it, you could say to be is to be anxious.
Let's talk a little bit about the traditional psychotherapeutic model for dealing with anxiety versus the philosophical counseling approach, because they're very different, right? What I've heard you just say is you have validated and normalized that anxiety is a fact of the living, right? If we're here, we will experience it, where traditional therapeutic models look at the desire to eradicate suffering by multiple means, whether it's through medication or talk therapy or methodologies of therapy. The idea is to eradicate. And maybe that's not such a good approach.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. There's a fundamental difference in thinking about anxiety as something that is inevitable and a component of one's life, and thinking about anxiety as a disease or a problem and something that needs to be, as you said, eradicated from our lives by any means necessary, right? So I think the first approach will require us to accept anxiety into our lives and to almost accept that it's going to take up a certain amount of space, and it will move us towards finding ways to live with anxiety, to develop resilience in the face of anxious moments. The second moment, I think the second approach can sometimes even cause a certain amount of anxiety, because you might feel, I was promised that I was going to be able to eradicate anxiety, and yet I find myself
I
still
find that amusing.
anxious, right? There's a sense in which if someone tells you that something, that there is a solution on the way and the solution doesn't work, that can actually make you more anxious about it.
It can piss you off.
Exactly. Now, in saying all of this, I don't mean to downgrade or in any way diminish the suffering of those people who suffer terribly from anxiety. We know that some people are incapacitated by anxiety. We know that some people, often report that anxiety makes it unable, makes it very difficult for them to live the kinds of existences and lives they want to. I don't mean to diminish any of that suffering. What I do want to be a little bit cautious about is, I think, two things. One is responding to anxiety as if it's a kind of medical condition and being sort of trigger happy in prescribing medications and, magic brews and potions about whose effects we don't fully yet understand. And secondly, I think in following that medicalized model, we might be taking our eye off the various social, cultural, and political formations that might be making us anxious. In my book, amongst the many approaches I talk about, there is the kind of materialist approach. Like, why are we anxious? Is it because our world is constructed in such a way that the choices we have to make us especially anxious? We live in the United States. I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that for the majority of Americans, even the slightest medical affliction can make us very anxious, because if our minds were to go down that rabbit hole of thinking of what could happen to us, a trip to the hospital could very easily mean my family, losing our home and being out on the sidewalk, so to speak.
Yeah.
Right? If someone tells, a young mother that we're gonna be laying you off next month, or, you can go home today because we don't need you anymore, we're not just like responding to a loss of livelihood. We're responding to a real visceral fear that we're not going to be able to take care of ourselves, that our life and limb are threatened, right? So we can live in more or less threatening environments. We can live in environments that are more or less anxiety inducing. We can live in cultures and societies and political climes that can exacerbate what I would call a kind of a baseline existential anxiety that all of us human beings feel. So we're always going to be anxious, but we could make ourselves considerably more anxious by the choices we make, by the world we live in, by the kind of world we construct and come to inhabit, right?
Yeah, point well taken. That sometimes in the pursuit of free choice and free will, we undermine our own well-being.
Very much so. Very much so. I think this is sometimes there's an example I use in my book. When I go out shopping for insurance plans, I'm thrust into this bewildering zone of options, deductibles, co-pays, prices, which plan should I take? Fine, I'm exerting my choice and my freedom, but I don't think people sometimes understand that having to exert certain kinds of choices can actually inhibit my choices in other areas. And if one choice is actually taken care of and set, it frees me up. I think it's something that like married people find out all the time. Like once you have a partner, you are free to do lots of other things in life, right?
Yes.
So I think there's this way in which sometimes, choice and freedom gets talked about as if it is always this unvarnished, unmitigated good, and you should have it in every sphere of your life. Well, choices cause decisional anxiety. And to be constantly thrust into spaces where you have to make choices again and again and again can be quite anxiety inducing. Perhaps if some things were secured for us, it's like someone saying, you get to choose your parents every week. Wouldn't that be great?
Oof,
I'm
no.
like, no, I'd like to
No.
have one set of parents. Thank you.
Good or bad, doesn't matter.
Yeah, exactly.
Because that taps into the story, right?
Yeah.
Which we talked about before we started recording our interview about the story or the narratives that we tell ourselves about our experiences and ourselves, and how that plays into our anxiety or our subjective well-being.
Very much so. Very much so. We are creatures who look back upon the past and we construct a narrative about what our lives have been, and that affects the way that we perceive our lives that we are living right now. And I think one of the important features of philosophical counseling is that, like psychotherapy, it is interested in the narrative that you tell about your life, but it is also interested in making you investigate your beliefs and your values, making you more self-transparent and more self-aware, and reflecting on how the beliefs and values that you have chosen or that you have come to adopt over a period of time are making you look back on your life in a certain way, and of course are affecting the way you're living your life right now, right? And I think all of that has to play a role in the kinds of things that we make ourselves anxious about, and the kinds of things that in some ways we were bound to feel anxious about, right?
Let's talk a little bit about philosophical counseling and interest. I mean, there's interest in the media. There are a couple of articles that were recently published. One was in the New York Times several months back, contrasting and comparing the usefulness of philosophical counseling to traditional psychotherapy. And it really piqued my interest, which led me to you. And I'm so glad that we're able to have this conversation, because it opens a different door for conversation.
Right. So one really interesting thing about the relationship between psychotherapy and philosophical counseling is this. Sometimes people will ask me, they'll say, are you a psychotherapist? And I will say, no. And the reason I say no is because psychotherapist is now a legal term, right? It's a term that implies licensure and all kinds of state requirements. So I'll say, no, legally, I'm not a psychotherapist. However, when you look at the etymology of the term psychotherapy, it comes from the Greek psyche, which means soul, and the Greek therapia, which means healing, right? So psychotherapists are soul healers. And soul healers, of course, is the phrase that is used in ancient philosophy to describe philosophers. So philosophers in that sense are the original psychotherapists. They encourage the use of philosophical reflection to think about how we may live the good life in face of the constraints that existence places upon us. How are we to live? What kinds of decisions and choices should I make so that I can do right by myself, the people that I care for? What are my moral duties? Given that certain kinds of suffering are inevitable in this world, as all the ancient philosophical traditions had realized, how should I conduct myself? Right? Now, these are questions that have been around forever, and philosophers have been thinking about them forever, right? And I would say in the ancient philosophical traditions, the notion of philosophy as therapy is actually quite overt. You find it in the ancient Greeks, you'll find it in Buddhism, you'll find it in Indian philosophy, that the greatest achievements of the philosopher or the thinker are always that he or she is able to bring herself or himself into consonance with the universe, with the existence, and find some measure of harmony, peace, and contentment. And of course, that's why people go to psychotherapists now, right? And I think historically what's happened is, over the years, philosophy has this relationship to other academic disciplines, which is that as philosophical questions become more defined and they admit of certain kinds of well-defined answers, we find different fields of inquiry splitting off and becoming separate disciplines, and philosophy is kind of left with the toughest and unanswerable questions, right? Which is why people think that philosophy doesn't make progress. These philosophers are still talking about the same things they did 2,000 years ago. And I would say,
have we changed that much? Actually, have human needs really changed that much?
Really, exactly. So, we're still talking about the same questions because we are left with the toughest questions of all. After all, the people we call scientists now used to be called natural philosophers in the old days. The thing that we call science, modern science, really only came about in the 16th or 17th centuries once a scientific method became more codified, more formal. So I think what's happened between psychotherapy and philosophy is that philosophy became more specialized. It kind of became more academic. It became something that was taught in universities. People got degrees in it. It became professionalized. It was supposed to be the kind of thing that only did metaphysical speculation or commented on the sciences. And psychology branched off as a separate field. If you think of people like David Hume and John Locke, if they were teaching and writing today, they would be in departments of psychology and they would be considered cognitive psychologists because they were concerned with how the mind worked, how it acquired knowledge, how we form beliefs. And so what's happened is that these specialized psychotherapeutic regimes have developed, right? We have psychoanalysis and many of the different spin-offs of psychoanalysis. But in all these disciplines, if you go into their foundations, if you look at the histories of these disciplines, if you look at the histories of the founders, they were philosophers. They were philosophers. If they weren't philosophers in degrees, they were philosophers in orientation and attitude. They used philosophical models about the human mind, about what human nature was like, about what human existence was like. They kind of put an empirical, framework, around this, and they built up certain methods. But if you look at the methods, if you look at the kinds of questions they're concerned with, the assumptions and models that they work with are philosophical. Sometimes the methods are even philosophical. But I think what's happened is that philosophy sort of vacated the arena. Philosophers kind of said, they kind of abandoned it to psychologists, psychoanalysts, various clinical domains. They kind of left, right? And I think what philosophical counseling is trying to do is to sort of remind people of what philosophy is meant for. We're not just here to count the angels of a head of a pin. We are here to help people live the good life, to encourage philosophical reflection, to look inwards as well as outwards, to realize the oldest philosophical truth of all, which is that the only thing we have control over is our own actions, thoughts, and choices.
Amen. Right? We should stop there and take a pause. We're going to come back in a few minutes. Right now, we're talking with Dr. Samir Chopra about his book, Anxiety, A Philosophical Guide. To learn more, please go to samirchopra.com. Here comes the pause. We'll be right back. Hang on just a second here. Before we take that break, I want to remind everyone about the pleasure of looking good and having good hair days. Way offers a complete hair care solution that promotes fuller looking, healthier feeling, and happier hair for everyone. Fine, medium, or thick hair, Way has got you covered. From volume and shine to deeply hydrating, Way helps you find your way to good hair days every single day. I use a blend of several Way product combinations in rotation to make my superfine postmenopausal hair look and feel at its best. My favorite Way product is their leave-in conditioner that makes my hair feel soft, silky smooth, and smelling like I'm on vacation. Not sure of your hair type? Take Way's hair quiz to find out. You can also stock up and save with 32-ounce shampoo and conditioner refill pouches. Treat yourself to great self-care and good hair days with Way's best-selling products. Live life your way and really mean it. Wash your way to healthier hair with shampoos and conditioners made just for you. Go to theouai.com and use code HH for 15% off your entire purchase. That's theouai.com, code HH. Now here comes that pause. We'll be right back. Each day we have the intellectual freedom to be happy or the liberty to be miserable, regardless of external circumstance. If you or someone you know is struggling with mental health, seek support because good psychological health is vital in the achievement of a happy and satisfying life. Visit harvestinghappiness.com for psychosocial educational resources to boost emotional and social intelligence. Like what you hear on Harvesting Happiness? Sharing is caring. Pay it forward by spreading the word to your community and through social media. Subscribe, listen, and share hundreds of downloadable episodes from wherever you get your podcasts. Connect with and follow us on most social media channels. And we're back, anxiously awaiting relief, a philosophical approach to the human condition. Let's get back to the conversation with my guest, Samir Chopra. So, Samir, let's go back to philosophical counseling and its application for or strategies for managing anxiety that we feel just by being alive?
So I would say this is true of anxiety, and it's probably true of any other difficult life situation that we find ourselves in, or any other quote unquote mental health problem. We typically only have three approaches to any difficult situation that we find ourselves in. The first approach is what I'd call escape, right? You find yourself in a difficult situation, so you leave, right? You get out of Dodge. You're like, I'm done. I don't want to be in this situation anymore, right?
Yeah.
Married people break up, they divorce, people leave. There are people migrate from countries they don't like, and so on and so forth. That's escape, right? The second is activism, which is that the thing that you don't like, you try to change it, right? The roof is leaking, so I go get the repair kit and I get to work on the roof and I fix it. That's activism. But let's say that you cannot escape the situation. Let's say you cannot change the situation. Then what option do you have, right? You are confronted with the unalterable. Then the only option that I think you have, and I think this is philosophy's answer, is that you must reinterpret or reconstrue that which is unalterable, right? And, many wise psychiatrists, psychotherapists, and philosophers have converged on the same truth, that if there is something that you are going to be stuck with that is unpleasant and inevitable, and it is problematic for you, you must take a quote unquote philosophical approach towards it, which is that you reconceptualize it, you reconstrue it, you interpret it in such a way that the very identity of the thing changes, right? You have understood it differently, right? So, one of the approaches, one of the ways I like to think about this is like, think about life. Escape from life means what? That you end your life, right? That's not a viable option for us. We want to keep on living. We want to abide by our duties, take care of the relationships we have with people. We have life goals. Sometimes we can change these conditions. Now, if those conditions are something that you can change, then by all means, go ahead and do so, right? Maybe your job is making you anxious and you can change the job. But can we really change the conditions of existence? We cannot make ourselves immortal. We cannot make ourselves unconscious of the passage of time. Though, mind you, there are important philosophical techniques that urge us to stay in the moment so that we're not constantly thinking about the past and the future, right? It is not a coincidence that so many ancient philosophical and modern therapeutic traditions always come back to this: stay in the moment, learn to meditate, be mindful, because that's the only way that you can remove yourself from the cycle of time where you're thinking about the past and anticipating the future, right?
Hang on one sec, because I think there's another important element to staying in the moment. And that is that 99.9% of the time, the moment that we're in is just fine.
Yeah. Yeah.
The calamities occur are events that occur outside of the moment.
Very true. We are either regretting the past or we are anxiously anticipating some bad thing that is going to happen to us in the future, right? Or, and I sometimes call anxiety anticipatory fear, where I think that something bad is going to be happen to me in the future. So I start anticipating how I will feel at that bad point, right? And this, like I said, is the Buddhist second arrow, which is that the fact that you're going to die, for instance, at some point in the future is bad enough. I am aware of the fact, I know it. But if I'm anticipating how I'm going to feel at the point, then I'm suffering twice. I'm suffering not only when it will happen, I'm suffering now because I'm anticipating that bad thing happening, right? So I think, to circle back to the question that got us started, I would say that if we are confronted with aspects of our existence that are unalterable, then I think what you have is a kind of reconstrual that offers a way out. We must come to reinterpret what we are confronted with so that we can come to live with it in some resilient fashion. And I think that's very true of anxiety. Once we come to understand and once we come to accept, really, truly, that we are the kinds of creatures who will always be anxious in some measure or the other, then why not find a way to live with it, let it into our lives, and maybe even think about the ways in which anxiety actually works for us. For example,
Yes.
when I confront my anxiety, I really know what my most deeply held values are and what my most deeply held duties are. Like, I know at this moment that the things that make me the most anxious are the fates of my loved ones, even more than my own fate. I care about my wife, my daughter, my brother, my family members, and to know that I'm scared about what might happen to them, that I'm anxious for them, it tells me I love them. They're important to me. That if I have duties in this world, it is to them. That I must live my life in a way that makes me cognizant of those duties, that makes me fulfill those duties. So anxiety is a messenger to me for myself. It tells me what my most important values and possessions are in some sense, right? So I think to accept anxiety into our lives is to accept ourselves, that I am this kind of being. I will be this way. And I think self-acceptance is, one of the greatest gifts we can bestow upon ourselves is to accept who we are and to come to learn to live with ourselves.
Hmm. And, it's interesting you say that, because when we reject parts of ourselves, right, we project that judgment or lack of acceptance onto others.
Mm-hmm. Very much so.
Because that energy has to go somewhere.
That energy's got to go somewhere. It's like if we've got that rejection directed towards ourselves, there's a way in which we make it less likely that we will be able to accept our place in this world either, right?
Yeah. And we all do have a right place in this world. I mean, maybe that's the job of the human condition in its highest form, is to figure that out.
Yeah. Lisa, one thing I've been thinking about in this conversation as we've been having it is that, the other strands of anxiety, I think you said it quite beautifully when you said there's a place for us in this world. I think coming to accept our uniqueness, the singularity of the fact that I exist at this point in space and time, there has never been anyone like me, and there never will be anyone like me. I am quite sure of that. If we take that on board, we really come to accept ourselves as so amazingly, beautifully unique. And we come to accept, hopefully, that there is no need for me to compare my life with anybody else's. There's no need for this endless invidious comparison that like debilitates us day in, day out. Am I living the right kind of life? Am I making the right decisions? Is my partner, beautiful enough? Is my child precocious enough? Do I have the right kind of job? These questions are, they arise from this never ending, relentless comparison that I think our society and our culture forces upon us, because it places so many scales, so many evaluative scales upon our life that we cannot help but keep on comparing ourselves. But if we accept our uniqueness, that I am who I am and there's nobody else like me. I mean, think about what an amazing thing that is to say about yourself.
It's huge, actually.
It really is. Like, we're so, we're like, when they say like no snowflake is exactly like another one, or no crystal is exactly like another one. I'm like, yeah, and we're just like that. We are completely and beautifully unique. In the history of the universe, there's been no one like me, right? And there won't be. So like, we take that uniqueness on board, it kind of lends a beauty to our lives, which, our lives are beautiful regardless of whether I do anything that my society approves of or not. They just are, just by the fact of being, in some ways.
And regardless of being anxious or not. Like, exactly. That the anxiety coexists with this uniqueness.
Beautiful. Yeah.
Right.
Exactly.
Like, okay. So there it is. I'm at times we're all anxious, but what I hear you say so beautifully, or I'm paraphrasing what I'm hearing you say, is that the relationship to the anxiety, the relationship to ourselves, the relationship to our place within the world actually is the issue.
Yes, very much so.
And when we get right with that, if some of these things, it's like a weight is removed from our shoulders.
Yeah. I think, not to sound too sweeping or too broad or too pompous, the disjunctures between our states of mind the disjunctions between the states of our mind and the world outside, those differences are what cause us unhappiness or dissatisfaction. And so in some ways, I would say the philosophical approach or the philosophical attitude to life is that we find a way to bring ourselves into consonance with the outside, with all of the rest of existence in such a way through our beliefs, our values, and our actions, so that we can live the kinds of lives we want. And we can figure out which goods are the most important for us in our life to have. And, when I think of Freud's theories of anxiety, he offered 3 different theories of anxiety. And his central one centered on anxiety arising from our fear of the loss of love. And I think in my work in philosophical counseling, in my work as a philosopher, I think one of the things I've come to realize is that human beings want and need and should have love in their lives. And many of us, if not most of us, are anxious because we are fearful about losing love. And of course, death is the ultimate form of the loss of love because we lose everyone that we cared for. But I think even in our daily lives, we are scared about social disapproval. We are scared that we will make choices that people will disapprove of. We are scared that our family and friends will not love us enough if we don't make the right kind of money or don't have the right kind of success or don't make the right choices. And I think that's why religion appeals to some people, because we are told that there is a source of love that is never ending, that is infinite, that will take you into its bosom no matter what you do. That's got to provide us some kind of cosmic reassurance, right? That I will be in some ways not alone and taken care of. And I think that's the ultimate solace that I think at some point we all are looking for. And anxiety reflects that kind of fear as well, that we might not have it.
I love what you just said about the cosmic reassurance. That is, those words, they connect,
Yeah.
I think that whether we are religious or not, whether we're spiritual or not, sort of the understanding that somehow we are in the rhythm of this existence, is comforting.
It's comforting, yeah. And I think that's one thing that love really does for us. Love tells us that there's a place for us, that there's a place for you no matter where you go, no matter what you do. And I think that's why we like the kind of love we received early in our lives. If we were lucky enough, we got the unconditional love of our parents. And that was probably the most amazing thing. And I think, one of the things that we have to deal with and accept is that when we go out into the outside world, we might not get love exactly like the ones that our parents give us, but we should accept with generosity the love that other people are able to give us and not denigrate and downgrade the love they can.
And if one didn't receive that unconditional love, that ideal of unconditional love, it does not mean that it cannot be created in one's present life.
Very much so.
To learn how to do it,
Exactly.
to do it for ourselves and do it for the people that matter to us.
Exactly. And I think love is one of those things that, this is one of the wisest things my mom said to me. She said, the more you give, the more you get. And I think there's a lot of truth in that. And also being able to open up ourselves to the different forms in which love is made available to us, so that we aren't stingy or that we aren't too picky and say, no, I want love precisely in this very form. And if I don't get it, I'm going to remain angry and depressed and
anxious.
Rageful. Yeah, and anxious. Exactly. Right?
Yeah. Love is love, right? I mean, that's the other side of it, is you look at to be a loving person and to be able to receive the love from others requires a state of surrender to a certain degree, right? It's not that you abandon everything, but it's that openness to the expression, which might be different from the script.
Very much so. Very much so. I think that's why a lot of people talk about, opening the heart, letting it come in. And I think those are very suggestive, and they are suggestive because they speak to this idea of being not just generous in giving, but being generous in accepting as well, right?
Yes, the generosity in the acceptance. And I think that's a challenge for so many of us.
Yeah, I think because we've got it framed in our minds that the only right kinds of gifts or the only right kinds of things that people can give us should come packaged in certain forms. And I think that makes us cruel because we reject other people's love. And I think in doing that, we're engaging in a kind of self-mutilation. When I think about what people call depression often, is that, I think people are depressed because they've not received the kind of love they wanted, or they had a kind of love and they lost it. And they're now responding with anger, right? I think sometimes in my work, I think the shadow of anxiety is the fear of the loss of love. And the shadow of depression is anger over the loss of love and not being able to get it back again, right?
I agree with you. But I also want to add, because we're out of time, that one of the gifts that I've received from spending time with you today is Anxiety, A Philosophical Guide, which is your newest book. And I would love for our listeners to investigate, be curious, and head on over to samirchopra.com. Thanks again for being with me today, for sharing part of your day, at least here.
Thank you so much, Lisa, for having me on. I really enjoyed this conversation.
Me too. Thanks for joining us on Harvesting Happiness today. This is Lisa Cypers Kamen on behalf of my guest, Samir Chopra, wishing you kind thoughts, kinder words, and the kindest of actions. Until next time, remember, happiness is an inside job. Happiness is your inside job. Please go out and rock your day, and remember to be kind to one another. Want to take a deeper dive into sound ideas for better well-being? Check out our new bonus edition content, More Mental Fitness by Harvesting Happiness, available exclusively on Medium and Substack. Keep harvesting your own happiness anytime, anywhere from the comfort of wherever you are. Subscribe, listen, and share hundreds of downloadable episodes from wherever you get your podcasts. Connect with and follow us on most social media channels. To learn more about lifestyle management and mental fitness consulting services, please visit harvestinghappiness.com. Harvesting Happiness and More Mental Fitness are produced by me, Lisa Cypers Kamen, Andrea Mengele, Robin Boyd, Andrea Daly, and the awesome team at Podfly Productions, including Eric Begay, Kimberly Beck, and Alec Guess, in collaboration with TogiNet Radio, KBUU, RadioMalibu.net, and is available on PRX, the Public Radio Exchange.